Chapter 44:13. Yi-Huan went out first and saw the door of the suite. Mo came from behind. He didn't go around to the front of her. Instead he reached out and opened the door through her body. It looked like he was holding her in his arms. Yi-Huan was a little embarrassed. They had been intimate countless times, but she still felt uncomfortable when they weren't even touching. After her miscarriage she didn't seem to be able to be intimate with him. At this time her avoidance naturally made Mo a little uncomfortable. Mo's eyes were dyed with a layer of black ink. He silently looked at her and went in first. Yi-Huan followed behind him. He closed the door and looked down at her for a while. Then he took off his jacket and walked over to call for food. "I'm not hungry." Yi-Huan bit her lip. "I want to talk to you about Yi-Huan, and I'm hungry." Mo stared at her and said coldly. With that said, he walked to the wine cabinet and took out a bottle of red wine. Then he took out 2 glasses and poured one for himself and one for her. He didn't hand it to her but held the glass and drank it slowly. Yi-Huan stood there and pursed her lips. She didn't say anything. They used to be husband and wife, but now they were frighteningly distant. In the end it was Mo who spoke first. "Take off your jacket and sit down to drink a glass of water. You're as pale as a ghost. Even if you want to do something to me, I don't think I have the appetite." Yi-Huan wanted to refute but she held back. She did as he said. He put down the glass in his hand and poured her a glass of water. When he handed it to her, his fingers touched her palm. It was cold. Mo looked at her silently for a while. Then he walked back to the bar and drank his red wine. It seemed that he wasn't satisfied. He lit a cigarette and took a puff. His cold expression finally seemed to soften a little. Perhaps he felt a little better. But after he took a few puffs, Yi-Huan coughed. Mo sat behind the bar and looked up at her. "Did you catch a cold?" Just these 3 words were enough to make people feel a little overwhelmed by the favor. Yi-Huan shook his head. Mo was still staring at her but he put out his cigarette. Just then there was a knock on the door. He got up to open it and pushed the dining cart in. The meal he ordered was very sumptuous. How was it a midnight snack? It was clearly dinner. Mo set the table and looked at Yi-Huan. "Come and eat." She still wanted to say that she didn't want to eat, but Mo's expression was very ugly so she could only sit down. The 2 of them didn't speak, they just ate together in silence. Mo obviously didn't eat at the banquet. In fact, he didn't have a good appetite these days so he ate quite a lot. Yi-Huan was hungry and ate as much as a kitten. "Do you not like to eat or do you not like to eat with me?" He looked at her quietly as if he was in a difficult position. Yi-Huan looked up at him, then lowered her head and continued eating. While thinking about some things, he ate a little fiercely and quickly. By the time her stomach was completely uncomfortable, her face was as white as a sheet. She covered her mouth and rushed to the bathroom. She vomited everything she had eaten, even her bile. Mo walked over quickly. His hand hesitated for a moment but he still put it on her shoulder. He also felt her body stiffen for a moment. He whispered, "What's wrong?" Yi-Huan was still a little stiff. She bit her lip and whispered, "Maybe I caught a cold and ate too much. My stomach feels a little uncomfortable." Chapter 44:14. As she spoke, she took out a tissue to clean herself up and turned around to rest. Mo had already picked her up and said in a hoarse voice, "Let me carry you." Before Yi-Huan could react, he had already carried her to the master bedroom. Yi-Huan was very weak. She bit her lip and hugged his neck in the end. Mo put her on the soft bed and poured her a glass of warm water before calling the doctor. Yi-Huan heard his call and struggled to sit up. "I'm fine. There's no need to call the doctor." Mo looked at her coldly, then hung up the phone after he finished speaking. He looked at her and picked up the glass of water from the bedside table. "Why don't you drink?" Yi-Huan looked down. "I don't want to." Mo held her shoulders with one hand and put the glass to her lips with the other. His voice was short and strong. "Drink." Yi-Huan looked at him in a daze. Mo. But the water had already reached her. She was forced to drink half a glass and shook her head to show that she didn't want to drink anymore. Mo put down the glass and helped her lie down. Yi-Huan didn't feel well and lay down quietly. She was probably tired. It was already past midnight. She actually fell asleep. Mo didn't continue eating. He looked at Yi-Huan for a while and then walked to the French window. He looked at the night sky outside and looked down at his phone from time to time. He was still wearing the clothes he wore at the dinner party. He was so cold that any woman would be tempted by him, but not his ex-wife Hee-hwan. He wondered how cold-hearted she must be to turn a blind eye to him. She only remembered Yi-hwan, her parents, and Rong-yu. When had she ever cared about him? Chin-mo closed his eyes as he thought about it. When Hee-hwan woke up, she was weak all over. She heard Chin-mo's deep and pleasant voice. He was probably afraid to wake her up, so he kept his voice low. He was asking the doctor about the precautions and the doctor was explaining patiently. Hee-hwan woke up but she couldn't face him, so she closed her eyes and pretended to be asleep. Chin-mo was talking to the doctor when he inadvertently lowered his head to look at Hee-hwan's face. He pursed his lips slightly and did not expose her. He only said a few more words to the doctor and sent him away. When he turned around again, he sat on the edge of the bed. Since you're awake, get up and eat something. You've vomited out everything you ate earlier. Eat something light before taking the medicine. It was pointless for Hee-hwan to continue pretending. He slowly opened his eyes. What's wrong with me? Chin-mo looked at her and reached for a bowl of red date porridge. He said in a low voice, "Sit up, I'll feed you." She was embarrassed. She propped herself up and felt a little dizzy. "I'll eat by myself." Chin-mo looked at her and didn't say anything. Hee-hwan was even more embarrassed and could only let him feed her. She didn't have a good appetite, but this bowl of porridge was surprisingly soft and delicious. 10 minutes later, she finished the whole bowl. Chin-mo put the bowl back and opened the medicine box. He said in a low voice, "The doctor said that you don't pay attention to your meals. You're slightly anemic and malnourished." Hee-hwan was a little dazed as she listened. When she came back to her senses, the medicine was already in front of her. She was stunned for a moment and instinctively resisted. She was afraid of suffering since she was young. "Do you want me to feed you by myself?" Chin-mo's voice was hoarse. Hee-hwan understood what he meant by feed her by himself. Of course she wouldn't let him feed her. She took the medicine hurriedly and popped it into her mouth. It was so bitter that her little face scrunched up. Chapter 44:15. Chin-mo looked at her. Her little face was bitter, and she looked up at him with a pitiful expression. Chin-mo's voice was hoarse. "Swallow it." She shook her head, still refusing the bitter medicine. But at this moment, Chin-mo pressed his hands on her shoulders and moved closer to her. Hee-hwan's eyes widened. She knew what he was going to do, so she immediately covered her mouth and swallowed the medicine. She was a little timid the whole time. Chin-mo looked at her and slowly let go of his hand. After he took his hand back, Hee-hwan coughed. When she saw him again, she wanted to say something, but Chin-mo stopped her. "Go to sleep. We'll talk tomorrow." She still wanted to say something, but Chin-mo had already pressed her shoulders again, half forcing her to lie down. Hee-hwan moved and said indifferently, "If you want to talk, then we have nothing to talk about." So Hee-hwan understood that she could either go to sleep now or get out. He had expressed it vividly. She had no choice but to close her eyes and sleep. Actually, she was still a little scared. She was afraid that Chin-mo would sleep with her. But she closed her eyes for a long time and there was no movement. She opened her eyes and was stunned. Chin-mo stood at the head of the car and locked his eyes on her. He didn't say anything and just looked at her. For some reason, Hee-hwan immediately closed her eyes. She didn't dare to look at him anymore. They had been husband and wife for many years, but his gaze at this moment still made her feel a little scared. Then she closed her eyes. Chin-mo's voice was low and hoarse. "We'll talk tomorrow." As he said that, he bent over and covered her with the quilt. He looked at her deeply before he wanted to leave. His arm was caught by Hee-hwan. He turned around. Hee-hwan held him with one hand and opened her eyes. She looked at him with a pleading expression. "Chin-mo, I beg you." He looked at her quietly and said after a long time, "Go to sleep first. We'll talk tomorrow." Still, he gently pried her hand away and walked out of her sight. Hee-hwan was in a daze. After a long time she bit her lips and there was a hint of pain in her eyes. In fact, she knew in her heart that Chin-mo probably wouldn't give in so easily. She didn't know what he was thinking. She was very sleepy, tired, and uncomfortable. She closed her eyes and eventually fell asleep. Chin-mo walked out and looked at the table quietly. Of course, he was not in the mood to continue eating. He walked to the French window and stood there for a while, then lowered his head and lit a cigarette. He slowly smoked and stood there until late at night. His posture was cold and aloof. Actually, it was lonely at the top. Who could understand his loneliness? When the ashes between his fingers burned out, he tried again but couldn't find anything. Only then did he let out a long sigh. China Mo turned and walked into the bedroom. He Huan was still asleep. He looked at her quietly for a long time before taking his bathrobe to the bathroom. When he came out, he felt refreshed and quietly looked at He Huan. In the end, he was probably angry that he didn't sleep with her and slept somewhere else. When He Huan woke up early in the morning, China Mo had already gotten up and was tying his tie. Seeing that she sat up, he quickly tied his tie and walked over to touch her face. You had a low fever last night. Later, he stayed by her side for the whole night. He Huan looked at China Mo. Her throat was a little sore and a little hoarse. Where are you going? Have a meeting. He looked at her quietly. Get up and have breakfast with me. We'll talk about it when I come back. Chapter 44:16. He Huan's lips were pale and pink. She stared straight at him and wanted to reject him, but China Mo said forcefully, I'll leave in half an hour. Do as you see fit. He Huan bit her lower lip. When are you coming back? China Mo was still staring at her. After a while he said indifferently, about the same as last night. You'll stay here. What do you need? He Huan interrupted him. I'm here to talk to you about something. If you can't wait, you can go back to B City, he said coldly. He Huan's temper flared up. She immediately got up, but then she regretted provoking him. In the end, she took her clothes and went to the bathroom. She came back 2 minutes later. China Mo sat at the dining table with a cold expression. He Huan quietly sat opposite him and began to eat breakfast. He had a Western style and He Huan only had a bowl of red dates and longan porridge in front of her. Looked very nourishing. China Mo put the spoon in the bowl and looked at her. Finish the porridge and eat the medicine. She nodded. China Mo was still staring at her. I'll watch you finish it. Actually, He Huan couldn't take it anymore. I'll eat it. I don't believe you. China Mo's expression was cold. I want to watch you finish it. He Huan could only eat the porridge silently and then eat the medicine as if she was angry. Because it was too bitter, her little face was wrinkled. She looked a little pitiful and cute. China Mo's face had been tense for a long time. Looking at her, he finally relaxed a little. He pushed a glass of water in front of her and said in a slightly low voice, Drink some water. He Huan looked at him for a long time and then hummed in a low voice. China Mo watched her drink the water. After drinking the water, He Huan looked at him and asked, Do you have time to talk when you come back tonight? At this moment she was humble because she had been tormented by him for a long time. China Mo said indifferently, We'll talk when I come back. It took him a long time to come back and he only came back late at night. He Huan was already asleep when she sensed China Mo returning from outside. She heard the sound of his clothes and the sound of him taking a shower. Then he returned to the master bedroom and stood by the bed for a while. He Huan was a little nervous, afraid that he would lie next to her. But in the end he still went out and probably slept in the guest room. After he left, He Huan finally heaved a sigh of relief. Her nerves all over her body relaxed and she slowly fell asleep. When she woke up, she was already on the plane. He Huan got up from the bed and looked around in confusion. Just then one of China Mo's secretaries came over and said in a sweet voice, Director He, you're awake. President Qin is in a meeting. He Huan knew that they were on a private plane. She sighed. Where are we going? Europe. The second secretary smiled. France, England, Germany. About 7 or 8 countries. President Qin's schedule is very full. 7 or 8 countries. He Huan frowned. Is this official business or a vacation? The second secretary's smile was a little subtle. You'll have to ask President Qin about this. We're just his followers. How could He Huan not understand? She didn't say anything more. She just sat on the bed and pulled the corner of the bed to look at the clouds outside. Seeing that she didn't want to talk, the second secretary didn't dare to disturb her and left quietly. After a while, China Mo walked in. You're awake? He Huan looked up. Did you add sleeping pills to the milk last night? China Mo didn't deny it. I added half a pill. Chapter 44:17. After she asked, China Mo looked at her silently. I added half a pill. He Huan was furious. Chinamo, you're shameless. He stared at her. You need to rest. His tone was indifferent, but He Huan was well aware of the domineering and forceful tone in his voice. She didn't say much to him. She sat up and looked outside for a long time. Then she turned to look at Chinamo. Where are we going now? Can Yi Huan be sent to my mother's place? She paused, lowered her voice and said bitterly, after all, I'm here with you, aren't I? Chinmo's eyes fell on her face. He didn't avoid the question, but he didn't agree either. He said calmly, the Yi family has the best education environment. There's nothing wrong with sending Yi Huan there. Yi Huan stared at him. Chinamo, are you kidding me? Yi Huan is my child. Do you want Yi Huan to marry Yi Xiaonan like Tang Sher? Her voice became more and more severe. You're using Yi Huan's happiness in exchange, aren't you? I know the Yi family is powerful, but Yi Huan is my child. I won't allow it. Her guardianship is in my hands, isn't it? Chinamo reached out to hold her sharp chin, gently touched her and chuckled. Yi Huan's face was pale. Of course, she knew that Yi Huan's custody was in his hands, so she had always been polite to him. However, she didn't expect him to use such a method. Chinamo, do you still have any feelings? She squeezed out an embarrassed smile. What are you going to do? Keep Yi Huan there? Chinamo stared at her. After a moment he chuckled. His deep voice reverberated through the Hun's chest, sounding very manly. Yi Huan, do you really not know what I want? Yi Huan glared at him. Of course she knew, but she was not willing to give it to him. She knew in her heart that if she returned to Chinmo's side once again, he would break her wings and never let her fly again. As for Yi Huan, career, life, freedom and Yi Huan were all things that she could not give up. Yi Huan didn't answer him. Instead she looked out the window. The private plane flew into the distance. She had followed him from country to country, passed through many places, and accompanied him to several film festivals and cocktail parties. Almost every day Yi Huan would put on an evening gown and accompany Chinamo to various places to socialize. After being married for so many years and then divorced, she finally realized how tiring and unhappy it was to be a qualified Mrs. Qin. For the past few days she had been sleeping with him and he had not touched her. But every night she was tense. She was afraid that he would suddenly become interested. Just like that, 10 days passed. Not only did Yi Huan not recover, but she also became weaker. Chinamo was dealing with business in the hotel suite. After the secretary finished reporting, she said, President Qin, have you noticed that director? He doesn't look too good? Should we let her rest? Chinamo looked at her and closed the document. Why would she say that? The secretary told the truth. Secretary, he said that Director He's health isn't good, so she asked me to remind President Qin that President Qin is a man after all, and women are more meticulous. Chinamo frowned. Are you saying that I'm not meticulous? Chapter 44:18. Hearing his rhetorical question, the second secretary didn't know what to do and didn't dare to say anything. After all, President Qin was the boss and not the approachable kind. The atmosphere was a little gloomy, but she didn't expect Chinamo to nod. Make arrangements for a private flight back in the afternoon. The second secretary's mouth fell open and her eyes widened at an abnormal angle. Chinamo just stared at her. Are you stupid? Why aren't you going out? The second secretary turned around and left immediately. She had just closed the door when Yi Huan came over. Looking for President Qin? The second secretary smiled. President Qin said he'll be returning in the afternoon. I'll contact the airport. The second secretary felt a little uncomfortable in front of Yi Huan, because Yi Huan was actually not young. She was in her early 30s, but she was small, thin and fair. She looked like she was about 22 years old, which made her a 28-year-old rookie in the workplace, look even older. The second secretary grabbed her hair and smiled a little foolishly. Just as she was about to leave, Yi Huan stopped her. Thank you. But the second secretary was stunned. Yi Huan said quietly, in the morning your President Qin said his next stop was Egypt. And now he changed his mind, probably because the second secretary had said something. The second secretary was also a smart person. Because King Entertainment was huge, it was already impressive that she could climb to become the second secretary of Chairman Qin. She didn't need to think to know what Yi Huan meant, so she scratched her head again. It's Secretary He's instructions. Yi Huan just smiled faintly and didn't say anything else. She walked into Qin Mo's study. The second secretary stood there for a while and shook her head. She didn't know if it was a good thing or a bad thing to be loved by President Qin like this. Anyway, she wasn't happy when she saw Director He. Which woman wouldn't be tired after being dragged around all over the world after giving birth? And she heard that President Qin did something Director He wasn't happy about. This couple looked harmonious, but the whole world knew there was a problem between them. Their expressions couldn't lie. He Huan opened the study door and used her body to block it. She stood quietly by the door and looked at Qin Mo. Qin Mo was originally dealing with work and had his head lowered. However, he did not need to look up to know that it was her. He asked softly, "What's the matter?" He Huan was still standing there and said softly, "You're going back to China in the afternoon, right?" "Yes." Qin Mo's eyes fell on the file. After a while he closed it and looked up at He Huan. "Sit on the sofa. Secretary Lu said you didn't look well. I don't think I mistreated you." Actually, she couldn't sleep well at night because she was afraid of him. But the more she was afraid of him, the angrier she got. After a few times of this, He Huan's health deteriorated. He wasn't unworried. The second secretary's words were just a way for him to get out of this embarrassing situation. After Qin Mo finished speaking, He Huan slowly walked over and sat down. Then Qin Mo got up, walked over and sat opposite her. He Huan felt a little uneasy. She had never thought that one day she would feel uneasy when she was with him. She pursed her lips and hesitated for a moment. "Qin Mo, can you let me and Yi Huan go?" "Let you go?" Qin Mo smiled. "I didn't say I wouldn't let you go. In fact, you can leave now. But you can't take Yi Huan away." He Huan was furious. "Do you have a heart? Yi Huan is your child." Qin Mo chuckled softly. "What's wrong with the Yi family? Yi Huan, you're overthinking. I'm just giving Yi Huan a good future." Chapter 44:19. Qin Mo chuckled. "What's wrong with the Yi family? Yi Huan, aren't you overthinking things? I'm just giving Yi Huan a bright future. You were the one who said that I would marry another woman in the future and have other children. So, Yi Huan is redundant just like the one you know. And I don't want to let you take advantage of me, so..." Before he could finish, Jun Yan was slapped in the face. He Huan had slapped him. He was furious. Biting her lip, she glared at him. "Qin Mo, you're inhumane." After she slapped him, her palm was burning. A red mark soon appeared on his face, which looked a little frightening. Qin Mo's gaze was a little scary, but he didn't get angry at her. He only said in a low voice, "Is that so? If I'm not human, then who is? Who is the beautiful existence in your heart?" He was the devil. She couldn't wait to leave. Yi Huan couldn't care less. She couldn't care less about anything. He just wanted to leave him. A sinister look flashed past Qin Mo's eyes. He had been holding it in for a long time and he didn't want to hold it in any longer. But when he stretched out his hand and saw the fear in her eyes, he suddenly realized what he had done. He had almost done the same thing again. He Huan's small body was curled up on the sofa. Her palm-sized face looked weak and weak. It was obvious that she had been bullied by him. Qin Mo's heart ached and he frowned. "I won't do anything to you." He knew that he had gone against his will. He clearly wanted to do something to her, and it was the kind of thing where he could do whatever he wanted. He was a mature man and there was no difference between having a wife and not having a wife. She wouldn't let him touch her and would show that kind of expression every time he touched her. What else could he do? Qin Mo also felt a little bored. He got up and walked into the washroom. "Take a break. We'll leave after lunch." He paused and turned his head. "You can think about your choice before flying to B City." He Huan was still sitting on the sofa, not moving. She knew what he meant too well. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were filled with exhaustion. After a long time, like a cat whose paw had been stepped on, she quickly jumped up and ran out. Even sharing the same space with him made her feel like a kind of restraint. When Qin Mo walked out, he saw that she was not there. His eyes were filled with some disappointment, but he did not say anything. He just quietly walked to the desk, wanting to continue working, but for a long time he did not read a word. In the end, the documents on the table were swept to the ground by him. His heart felt even more vexed. He walked to the French window and lit a cigarette. In fact, he knew in his heart that letting go of their marriage was the best choice. She hated him and rejected him. She didn't love him anymore. However, He Huan didn't know that he couldn't bear the thought of her not loving him. Qin Mo stayed in the study until lunchtime. When he entered the dining room, Huan was already sitting there. When she was alone, she would wear cotton home clothes. The loose clothes made her face look even smaller. Her long hair had grown to a certain length and it was black and straight. He walked over and sat at the main seat, looking at her silently for a while. Huan was a little lost in her thoughts. She used her fork to poke at the food. It didn't seem like she was eating, but more like she was venting something. Qin Mo silently passed a piece of streaky pork to her, and Huan poked at it. Chapter 44:20. Qin Mo silently handed a piece of streaky pork to her, and Huan directly poked it into her mouth. Instantly, the gravy of the streaky pork splashed everywhere, dirtying her little face. She was a little stunned and came back to her senses. Qin Mo looked at her. "You don't eat this?" Huan was very picky about food and didn't eat fat ones, but Qin Mo would occasionally eat a few pieces. He used to tease her like this when she was distracted. Huan came back to her senses and stared at the streaky pork in front of her. After a long time she whispered, "I don't like it." "You don't like it, so you're never willing to force it, right?" His words had a double meaning. "Huan, in fact there are some things I don't like very much, but I'm willing to accommodate you." She didn't want to talk to him at all. As he said that, she put the streaky pork into her mouth. Qin Mo's eyes narrowed. Because she never ate it, no matter how many benefits and threats there were in the past, she didn't eat it. But now she actually ate it. When Huan ate, her expression could be called numb. Qin Mo clenched his fingers and put down his cutlery. He didn't know what kind of mood he was in. "Stop eating." But Huan was still trying hard to eat. She didn't look like she was enjoying the food, but she was enduring it. What she was enduring wasn't the food, but him. Qin Mo reached out and pinched her chin, saying word by word, "I told you to stop eating." Huan didn't move and looked at him quietly. At this time she had eaten the streaky pork, which she hated the most since she was a child. It tasted worse than she had imagined, but it didn't seem very difficult. After a long time she said bitterly, "Didn't President Qin tell me to eat it? President Qin is so powerful that I seem to have to do whatever he wants me to do." Qin Mo felt that his breathing was painful. He let go of her chin and stroked her lips. His voice was very soft and gentle, but it was creepy. "Do you think I forced you? Huan, do you really think I can force you? Have I ever forced you to do anything you don't like? You're like a zombie in there. You don't even give me a smile. You look at me as if I'm your enemy. Huan, are you the only one in the world who feels pain? Feel pain too? Or do you think I don't feel pain? I'm bored and I'm just playing with you? No one asked you to do this." In contrast to his anger, Huan was very calm. "You can take back your passion and use it on other women. I think both Ai Jia and Su Ilya would be very willing to experience your passion." Qin Mo was still angry. He stared into her eyes and said word by word, "Huan, you have no heart. It was eaten by a dog. She didn't give in at all. Qin Mo, I'm a person, not a thing. I won't stay with you just because you like me. You can threaten me, but you really can't force me. If you want an answer, I can tell you now. My parents can be rich or ordinary. As for Huan, I'll find the best lawyer to fight with you." Qin Mo narrowed his eyes. "Did the streaky pork give you the courage?" Huan tightened her chin. "Whatever you say, Qin Mo, we're finished. I won't stay with you because of your threat. It's been so many days and I can't convince myself." Chapter 44:21. Huan's fingers clenched into fists. Then she got up from the dining room and walked towards the master bedroom. Qin Mo was also very fast. He quickly grabbed her hand. "Where are you going?" Huan flung his hand away and said in a hoarse voice, "I'm going back. I'm not going to take President Qin's private plane." Qin Mo's expression was very ugly. "Huan, do you know what you are talking about?" Huan looked at Qin Mo quietly and said with a hint of helplessness and despair in her voice, "Qin Mo, you know." She looked at him as she said that. For some reason she suddenly said, "I still hate streaky pork." "Then why do you still want to eat it?" Qin Mo's tall body moved forward silently, giving off a sense of threat. Huan didn't move. She just stared at him. "Because I have no choice." This time she really left. Huan didn't have much luggage. She only had a small bag which was mainly her passport. When she left, she didn't even look back. There was no trace of nostalgia. Chin Mo stood where he was, his slender body very tense. A moment later he suppressed himself and called his second secretary. I won't return to B City for the time being. Chin Mo didn't go back, so He Huan couldn't find him even though she wanted to. By the time He Huan returned to B City, it was already 20 hours later. She was very tired, but she still insisted on looking for Wen Yuan first. She wanted to ask her about Yi Huan's whereabouts. The two women met at a cafe and Wen Yuan was shocked when he saw He Huan. It had only been 2 or 3 months since he last saw He Huan. At that time He Huan looked healthy and energetic. Although she was still young now, she looked like a fragile doll. Wen Yuan didn't know about men's aesthetics, but she thought that most men would feel sorry for her, right? As soon as he spoke, his voice was a little hoarse. How did you lose so much weight? He Huan lowered her eyes. I don't know, but I had a miscarriage. I've been in poor health ever since. Wen Yuan was stunned. After a while he said, I heard that you stayed abroad with President Qin for a long time a while ago. There was news about her every day in the entertainment newspapers, but He Huan looked much better after putting on makeup. She didn't look as haggard as before. After Wen Yuan asked, He Huan lowered her eyes. I want him to return Yi Huan to me. As she spoke, she looked at Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan, I would like to ask you for a favor. Actually, Wen Yuan was already prepared, but at this moment he was also a little flustered. She pretended to be calm and took a sip of coffee. Then she thought for a while and said in a low voice, He Huan, it's not that I don't want to help you, but Yi Mulan sent Xiangnan and Yi Huan to boarding school together. Moreover, it's the Yi family's arrangement, so I can't make the decision on this matter. She asked Yi Mubai, but Yi Mubai refused to say. He Huan couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. However, she was well aware of the outcome. It was impossible for Chin Mo to let her take Yi Huan away easily. He must have made a strict arrangement. He Huan was stunned for a while, but she still stood up. Wen Yuan, I still have to thank you. She really couldn't blame anyone for this matter. She had to thank him for taking care of Yi Huan. Wen Yuan also felt a little guilty. He pursed his lips and said, He Huan, I'd better try my best to talk to Mubai. Maybe he can help you. At least you can meet him on the weekend. The kids had to go home on the weekend. Wen Yuan could still make the decision to meet them, but it was probably impossible for him to leave the Yi family. Chapter 44-22. She had made it clear and He Huan understood. She thanked her softly and left. She had a lot of things to do even though she was very tired now. Wen Yuan sat there alone and finished his coffee. Then he called Yi Mubai and said, I'm done. Come and pick me up. Yi Mubai came to pick her up immediately and arrived in less than 10 minutes. Wen Yuan got into the car and said while fastening his seatbelt, It's He Huan. Yi Mubai glanced at his wife and sighed. What are you trying to say? Wen Yuan's voice continued to be indifferent. Mubai, He Huan doesn't look well. You can't see the child and Chin Mo messed up the house. You men don't know how hard it is for a woman. Yi Mubai turned to look at his wife and smiled silently. How can I not know how hard it is for you? Don't I try hard to repay you every night? He was getting more and more indecent. Wen Yuan bit his lip and looked out of the window. If you want to repay me, return Yi Huan to He Huan. She looked at him anxiously. Wen Yuan was a mother and she had given birth to Yi Hui. After having a little girl, her mood was very soft. Yi Mubai touched his wife at the red light and sighed. I really can't make the decision on this matter. Chin Mo is looking for Yi Mulan. Think about my big brother. Why don't you go and persuade him? Yi Mubai sighed. Wen Yuan looked at him with a strange expression and snorted. You sound jealous. It's good that you know. His voice suddenly became gentle. So don't worry about it. How could Wen Yuan say anything else? He merely sighed softly and did not say anything else. After He Huan left the cafe, she went to the hospital to visit Rong Yu. When she returned to Su Cheng's place, she had fainted instead of recovering. When she woke up, she was in the hospital. It was Xingyuan Hospital. She opened her eyes and saw Qin Chen's smiling eyes. Long time no see, He Huan. You look much prettier. In the past, He Huan had been running around all day. Although she was beautiful, she was still far from her current sickly and weak self. She was really beautiful now. Not only was she beautiful, but she also had an extremely weak beauty. Even Qin Chen couldn't stand looking at her, let alone a man. Moreover, Chen was sure that his brother wouldn't be able to control himself. If he managed to hold it in, then he probably couldn't hold it in anymore. Just thinking about it made Chen feel a little happy. On the other hand, Huan was still very weak. She leaned against the headboard of the bed and looked very weak. Chen gave her a nutrient injection and sighed. After you had a miscarriage the last time, my mother knew about it too. After that, Mo sent Huan to the Yi family and quarreled with my parents very fiercely. Huan, you must have never seen my brother so crazy. It was as if he had lost his mind. It was as if he did not want anything, even Huan could be sacrificed. You should know what this means, right? Huan leaned against the bed. Her voice was a little weak, but she didn't relax at all. She said lightly, I don't care how crazy he is. I won't go back to him. Chapter 44-23. Huan looked down and didn't say anything. Hence, Chen knew that it was impossible. Huan hated Mo in his heart. Actually, if she were Huan, she would hate him too. On the day of her miscarriage, Mo wanted to create a scandal. Moreover, Chen knew that Mo didn't have any feelings for Su Huan, but it didn't mean that he didn't have any thoughts about her. At the very least, she would be his future wife. If Huan didn't have a chance. If Huan didn't get pregnant and miscarry, Mo and Huan would probably be the same. However, there were always accidents. This accident was Huan's pregnancy and miscarriage. At this moment, Chen felt that Mo was more flustered and distressed. However, Huan might not be able to understand his feelings. Mo probably didn't want to express it. Even if her sister expressed it, Huan wouldn't be able to bear it. She sighed and said, Huan, maybe your personalities are too similar. That's why you often hurt each other. But believe me, in this world no one will love you more than Mo. He's just afraid of losing you. Chen paused and lowered his voice. Or maybe you didn't give him a sense of security. Huan, men need a sense of security sometimes. Huan raised her head. It's impossible for me and him. Chen sighed. He could only say that Huan was too young. Which of the things that Mo wanted to do that he didn't accomplish? Her voice became gentle. Rest now. Your body can't be tortured anymore. Stay in the hospital for at least a week. Huan still wanted to say something, but Chen pressed on her. Listen to me. As she said that, she took the blood report from the side. Your body is very weak and your blood is very precious. Huan, you know what I mean. Huan leaned against the headboard. Her body was a little weak. At this moment she felt that there was nothing she could do. She could only wait. After Chen made arrangements for Huan, she immediately went back to her office after Huan fell asleep. After thinking for a while, she called Mo. Where are you? Abroad. Mo was a man of few words. Chen wasn't very polite to him. Then do you know that Huan is sick? Mo's voice suddenly lowered a few degrees. What happened to her? I thought you didn't care about her and only wanted to suppress the He family and wrong you, or give Huan away. Chen said sarcastically. In fact, she also thought that Mo had gone too far. Since he liked her, he should have pursued her properly and loved her properly. Why did things have to turn out like this? Mo's voice became a little hoarse. Get to the point. What happened to her? It's not a serious illness, but Mo, you let a woman who just had a miscarriage follow you all over the world. Her heart is still broken and her body is also injured. You also did so many things to her. Chen said something fair. Mo still didn't seem to be moved. After a while he said in a low voice, it's good that she's fine. Chen was a little stunned. After a while he asked in a low voice, aren't you coming back to see her? She will come to me. Mo said ruthlessly. Chen had to restrain himself from cursing out loud. After a while he said in a low voice, you'll regret it. Even if the He family falls, even if Rongyu has no future, even if you don't let Huan meet you, you know what kind of person Huan is. Brother, don't wait until the woman's heart turns cold. Chapter 44-24. Chen didn't know what Mo was thinking. He only knew that Mo had no intention of coming back. Chen was a little embarrassed. Was leaving a woman in the hospital really the right way to chase a woman? However, Chen couldn't ask. This was probably what Mo was sure about, so he was relieved. Being relieved didn't mean being at ease. President Qin, who was far away in a country, put down his phone and stood on the balcony of a banquet hall, looking at the night view outside. At this moment the bustling knight was alarmed. It wasn't gentle but a little sharp, just like his mood at the moment. Su Ilya walked to his side and handed him a glass of red wine. She said softly, "Is it about Director He?" Chinamo just glanced at her but he took the glass and drank slowly. He didn't say anything. He was even quieter than the knight. Su Ilya was a little bitter. Chinamo looked very lonely. She was here and they were friends and her family was better than He Huan's. She was just born a few years later but they were separated. Why couldn't he forget He Huan? She felt bitter in her heart and comforted him softly. "Why don't we go back to B City?" Chinamo still did not make a sound. He stood there quietly by himself. After a long time he suddenly turned around and walked out with large strides. Su Ilya was still standing there and she looked a little disappointed. It didn't feel good to be rejected by a man. Yes, rejection. Chinamo had always rejected her advances and she had wanted to give up many times, but she couldn't bear to before they made up. Chinmo's private plane returned to B City that night, but when he returned, it was already 20 hours later in B City. He went to the hospital and Chen told him that He Huan had been discharged from the hospital. Chinamo was silent for a long time. Chen made a cup of coffee and handed it to him. Then he said calmly, "In fact, her health is already very bad. She needs to rest. Stay in the hospital for a week and then rest for half a year without worrying about anything." She paused for a moment and said with a serious expression, "Chinamo, I have to tell you something. Prepare your thoughts." Chinamo looked at her. Chen lowered his eyes and said softly, "He Huan's body might not be suitable for pregnancy. Even if she gets pregnant she won't be able to keep it. In the future, don't let her get pregnant." Chinamo didn't say anything, but his fingers that were holding the coffee cup were a little pale. They couldn't have children. He had once thought about having another child not for the sake of inheritance, but for the sake of when they loved each other the most. But now it seemed to have failed. Chinamo closed his eyes slightly and after a long time he said softly, "Is there no other way?" Chen couldn't help but say, "Is this the point, Chinamo? You should think about how He Huan can return to you first. You hurt her all over and you still want to have a child." Chinamo opened his eyes and looked at his sister. His eyes were filled with coldness. Chen couldn't stand him anymore. She raised her hand and said, "I really admire you. Logically speaking, you and Big Brother like to raise children from young, but look at Big Brother. Cher is still a young girl and He Huan is as pale as a ghost." Although she was beautiful, Chen also felt sorry for her. After saying that, she glanced at her second brother's expression. Chapter 44-25. When Chinamo left the hospital he went to Rongyu's place. Of course he didn't go in. Instead he looked out the window. Rongyu already had Ai Mingming by his side. She was someone he was very familiar with. He didn't like or dislike her but he was surprised by Rongyu's choice. Rongyu was good in all aspects. He should have a better choice. But when Chinamo left he caught a glimpse of Ai Mingming's side profile. She looked like He Huan. Thus he understood why Rongyu had chosen Ai Mingming. He paused but didn't say anything in the end. When he returned to King Entertainment he stopped suppressing Rongyu's studio. After making this decision he stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at his business empire. He had let Rongyu off mainly for his own sake. Rongyu and Ai Mingming were like another Chinamo and He Huan. Just let them be together. Chinamo let out a long sigh. Just then Secretary He came in. "President Qin." Chinamo turned sideways. Secretary He came over and said helplessly, "The company's revenue increased by 10% this quarter." She knew that this wasn't good news for Chinamo. President Qin didn't lack money. He lacked women. Love turns to hate, love turns to hate. This was exactly the case for this good-looking and rich man in front of her. Sure enough, Co Qin was calm on the outside and on the inside. He just responded with a lazy, and didn't say anything else. Secretary He bit the bullet and said, "Oh right, the shares of Director He's cultural company dropped yesterday. If this continues, the future is bleak. President Qin, do you really want to continue?" Chinamo looked at Secretary He quietly. After a long while his Adam's apple moved slightly. "Continue. Just don't let it go bankrupt." He wanted to continue until He Huan came to beg him. Actually, wealth wasn't important to the He family. He Huan had a lot of savings. But if it collapsed like this, mentally, he knew he had gone overboard, but he couldn't think of any other way. Everyone was well aware of this, especially his parents, who were very angry at his behavior. They said that he was crazy and did not care about the friendship between the two families. However, if he lost He Huan, what was the point of having a good relationship with her? China Mo admitted that he was crazy. Crazy for her. Secretary He stood at the side, stunned for a long time. China Mo asked her indifferently, "Do you know where He Huan is?" "She left the hospital." "How is she now?" Secretary He let out a long sigh. "I've asked around. Director He has used her connections to finance her father's cultural company. The investment is estimated to be several billion, and Director He might also invest in it herself. She might even put her own studio under the He family's cultural company." Of course, China Mo understood He Huan's intention. He wanted to fight him to the end. He looked at Secretary He. "You go out first." Secretary He stood where he was and looked hesitant. "President Qin, isn't this too much?" "Too much." China Mo smiled bitterly. "Do I have to watch her leave me?" Secretary He didn't dare to ask any more and left first. Meanwhile, China Mo stood where he was and made a phone call. He Huan's year of hard work went down the drain. That night, the news of "Don't Tell Her" failing the censorship blew up on Weibo. It was the top 3 trending topics. Chapter 44-26. Of course, all the companies and investors related to the movie were done for, including the He family's cultural company. China Mo was a businessman and he knew how to take drastic measures. He Huan was easily beaten to the point where she couldn't fight back. But the consequences were severe. On the surface, King Entertainment's stock price even rose a lot, but China Mo wasn't happy. A week passed and He Huan didn't seem to have any intention of begging for mercy. Instead, he could see news of her on the gossip. Just as Qin Chen said, she was pale and frail. It made his heart ache. China Mo had a bad habit of sitting in his office and looking at He Huan's photo for the whole night. Sometimes he would go out for a walk. She was living in that apartment now and never called him. It seemed like she didn't care about He Huan anymore. Qin Mo's car was parked in front of her apartment. The lights in her apartment were off. He sat in the car and waited quietly until she came back. She didn't come back alone. Beside her there was a bodyguard who drove her back. With an expensive limousine and an elegant man, China Mo could tell at a glance that he was a rising star in the legal world. He had a good family background and good looks. Now he ran the most prestigious law firm in B City and was Yi Mulin's direct junior. He Huan's motive for being with him was obvious. China Mo sat in the car and watched them quietly. The car window was open and he was smoking. Of course, He Huan could see him, but she pretended not to. She was very tired, so tired that she didn't have the energy to face him. She said goodbye to Bai Shulan and pulled on her jacket to go home. Lawyer Bai saw China Mo and went to greet him. The Bai surname was not bad, so China Mo had no reason to sit in the car. When he opened the door and got out, he glanced at He Huan before responding to Bai Shulan. "Lawyer Bai, long time no see." "Yes, President Qin. I didn't expect to meet you here." Bai Shulan paused for a moment. "But I might have to meet President Qin often in the future because I took on Ms. He's custody battle case." China Mo had already lost his patience. "I'll leave it to my team of lawyers. As for my meeting with Lawyer Bai, I'll probably meet him as a man, right?" He wasn't stupid. If it was a friend or work relationship, he would only ask his assistant to do it. He wouldn't be so gracious. It was obvious that this man wanted to pursue He Huan. Now he knew what Qin Chen meant when he said that He Huan didn't need a man at all times. China Mo just felt a little unlucky that she could find such a man in a lawsuit. Before one wave of rivals in love had subsided, another wave had arisen. Bai Shulan smiled slightly. President Qin is right. Men were very straightforward with their words, and this sentence almost admitted his intentions towards He Huan. Qin Mo's expression would not be good. He stared at Bai Shulan, who didn't avoid it. He Huan is a very cute girl. Qin Mo narrowed his eyes. She's in her early 30s. Oh, she's 3 years younger than me, Lawyer Bai said nonchalantly. He saw that Qin Mo was about to make a move, so he smiled and said that he would leave first. He didn't mind that Qin Mo was still there. A mature and confident man probably wouldn't mind this. They had been husband and wife before, so pursuing now was nothing. Chapter 44-27. After Bai Shulan left, Chinamo stood there for a long time and smoked another cigarette. He raised his head and looked at He Huan's apartment. The lights were still on. As long as the lights were on, he would not leave. He stood there for a long time. The winter night was cold, but he could not feel it. He only felt that his heart and lungs were warm. It was not a good feeling. It was painful. If he had a choice, he would rather give up. However, he could not give up now. So, to a certain extent, he hated her. And he hated himself. There was no turning back for Chinamo, and he did not want to turn back. If it was painful, he would feel the pain until the end. Chinamo stood downstairs for the whole night. He Huan went out before 8 o'clock the next day. When she went downstairs, she saw Chinmo's car. She hesitated for a moment but still went over. Chinamo sat in the car and smoked as he looked at her. You still haven't given up? You want to fight for Yi Huan in court. You know you can't win, but you still decided to marry that pretty boy lawyer to get a bigger bargaining chip? He Huan's expression was ugly. She bit her lip and glared at the despicable man in front of her. Her voice was a little hoarse. Chinamo, you're despicable. I believe you haven't seen how despicable I am. He put out the cigarette. I can't bear to do anything to you. He Huan stood in the cold wind. Her whole body was trembling. She did not know if it was because she was angry or because of the cold. After a long time, her voice was as cold as ice. Then thank you, President Qin, for being merciful and leaving me with some warmth. Now I thank you. As she said that, she turned around and left without looking back. She got into her car and drove away. Chinamo sat there and lit another cigarette. Early that morning, He Huan got into a car accident. It was not serious, but her hand was bruised. She needed to rest. The media made a big deal out of Su Ilio and Chinamo for an entire day. Of course, Su Ilio, Chinamo and the others were also involved in the scandal. If Chinamo did not say anything about public relations, no one would do it. In the evening, Chen went to the ward. He looked at He Huan's bandaged hand and sighed. You'll have to stay in the hospital for at least half a month. He Huan, I'm not trying to scare you, but if you don't listen to me, your hand will have sequelae. He Huan lowered his head and said nothing. I'm serious. You can't go out anymore. I'll talk to Chinamo about your family. He's like a mad dog now. Chen couldn't stand it anymore. He Huan used to be so energetic and healthy. Although it was true that she was beautiful now, could she withstand a few more blows from Chinamo? That was good enough. As Chen spoke, he sighed again. Right at that moment, the ward door opened and Bai Shulan, the lawyer, came in. When he came over, He Huan naturally had to greet him. Since it was only her hand that was injured, it was no problem for her to get up. Thus she went to the small living room to talk to him. Chen stood there for a while, making sure that the woman with the surname Bai treated him as a man. Moreover, as He Huan's ex-sister-in-law, she could tell that Bai Shulan wanted to woo He Huan. She was too immoral. It was just a lawsuit, but she wanted to steal her brother's girlfriend. Chen was wearing a white doctor's robe. She was 178 centimeters tall and looked elegant. Coupled with her short hair and androgynous facial features, it was easy for people to mistake her for a man. She walked over and placed her hands on He Huan's shoulders. She leaned forward as if she wanted to touch He Huan's hair and said in a low voice, "Didn't I tell you to rest more? Are you being disobedient again?" Chapter 44-28. He Huan was stunned. She tilted her body and looked up at Chen. The relationship between them was indeed intimate, but it seemed to be different from usual. She was puzzled, but Lawyer Bai was even more surprised. This male doctor was very good-looking. He exuded a noble aura and didn't look like a doctor at all. He looked more like a male model. Moreover, he was very close to He Huan, so close that it felt like they were close. They didn't look like a doctor and patient but more like a couple. Lawyer Bai had to admit that this doctor and He Huan looked very compatible, so he looked at He Huan. He Huan was also a little annoyed. She knew Chen's personality, so she explained awkwardly, "This is Dr. Chen. He's very famous in the country." Bai Shulan was even more surprised when she said that. Of course, she had heard of Chen, the world's leading surgeon and also Chen Mo's sister. But the person in front of her was obviously a male doctor. Bai Shulan wasn't an idiot. so she quickly understood what the doctor was trying to do. She just smiled and maintained her composure. Then she passed a bouquet of white roses to He Huan. "This is for the patient." Qin Chen raised his eyebrows. What a clever confession. But he probably didn't know that He Huan would be allergic when she was weak. Sure enough, He Huan sneezed after taking a sniff of the flowers. Tears came out and her nose turned red. It was a very ugly scene. Bai Shulan was still asked to leave by Dr. Qin on the grounds that he had hurt her patient. Of course, she knew how to deal with He Huan's problem. She helped her spray some medicine on her nose and casually teased, "He looks like a good man." If Qin Mo knew, he knew. He Huan leaned against the headboard and said softly. Qin Chen looked at He Huan and asked slowly, "What do you think?" He Huan looked down. "Nothing, I just want Yi Huan back and my parents to be safe." When she said this, Qin Chen sighed again. You should also know Qin Mo's temper. Since he has chosen to shed all pretense of cordiality, he will go all the way. You must be mentally prepared. Now she couldn't even persuade He Huan. There was a feeling that Qin Mo had forced He Huan into a desperate situation, and Qin Mo was the one in front of him. Behind her was a bottomless abyss. Qin Chen could only take care of He Huan and accompany her to relieve her boredom. There was also good news. Rong Yu's condition had improved and he had been discharged. He just had to come back once a week for a checkup. By the way, he and Ai Mingming are married. They seem to have a good relationship. Qin Chen sighed. They're already together. Isn't this world too fantastical? He Huan was stunned for a moment and then she looked down. It's good. Ai Mingming is actually a very promising actress. Will you still use her if you have the chance? Qin Chen took it as a casual chat. He walked over and stretched out his hand to let He Huan lean on his shoulder. This was the strength of a boyfriend. The nurse was so envious that she cried. Indeed, Dr. Qin's shoulder only belonged to Director He. However, He Huan did look adorable. She was small, fair and fragile. The Qin siblings seemed to like her very much. In the nurse's mind there was already a rich family drama. The main characters were He Huan and the second generation of the Qin family. Chapter 44-29. Hearing Qin Chen's question, He Huan tilted her head and looked at her strangely. After a long while she said in a low voice, "I don't even know if I can act anymore." She didn't know if she would have a chance. The storm this time was almost devastating. She wasn't so optimistic that the He family could get out of it unscathed. As his daughter, she would choose to advance and retreat together with him. Qin Chen stared at her eyes for a long while and asked her in a low voice, "Do you hate Qin Mo?" He Huan looked a little absent-minded, then she lowered her eyes and said, "I don't know." How could Qin Chen not know? But because she loved him, she hated him. She couldn't say anything, so she told him that she had to go and help other patients. She was about to leave when He Huan stopped her. "Don't tell Qin Mo that I'm here." Qin Chen had already walked to the door. He leaned to the side and turned his head. Then he smiled meaningfully. He probably knows by now. After finding out that there was an adulterer and a husband, Qin Mo would pay attention to He Huan's movements from time to time. Yi Muyun and Qin Mo, these two brothers, had always fought together. They had never lost to anyone. It was just that their women were rather pitiful. After Qin Chen said that, He Huan's face turned pale again, but she didn't say anything else. Everything was quiet again. Qin Chen paused for a moment and then left. As soon as she returned to her office, she received a call from Qin Mo. She sighed and said, "You know?" Qin Mo nodded. "Let me have dinner first. Is that all right?" "I haven't stopped working yet," Qin Chen couldn't help but say. Her phone remembered to bring you wonderful novels. However, as soon as she finished speaking, the door of her office was opened. Qin Mo walked in, followed by Qin Chen's secretary, the nurse, whose face was red. President Qin was so handsome. Dr. Qin is also handsome, but President Qin is different. Dr. Qin was like a handsome man in a manga, but President Qin's masculinity couldn't be hidden even through his clothes. The young nurse suppressed the desire to scream in her heart and closed the door for them in a reserved manner. Qin Chen is a little helpless. "Is the entertainment industry going to close recently, Qin Mo? Is that why you come to your sister again and again?" Qin Mo glanced at her and then looked at Qin Chen's lunch. It was so luxurious that it made him doubt his life. A doctor was so extravagant that he ate even better than the CEO of a company with a net worth of hundreds of billions. Everything was of the highest quality. This was not a working meal. This was clearly the most high-end Michelin cuisine. Looking at Qin Mo's eyes, Qin Chen smiled. Are you hungry? Fior, let's eat together. I'm afraid that you will drool. That will be ugly. After all, in addition to being the CEO of the entertainment industry, you are also a man who is going to be in his 40s. If you can't take care of your wife, eating a mouthful of food is nothing. Qin Mo smiled coldly. Qin Chen, when did you become so mean? Qin Chen smiled as he ate the food. You're the one who's mean to your ex-wife. Do you want me to tell you one by one? Qin Mo still stared at her. Qin Chen smiled. Looking at his second brother's thin appearance, his heart softened. He pulled him over. It a little. He Huan's hand is injured and can't run away. She has to stay in the hospital this month unless her hand doesn't want to recover. A month? Qin Mo looked at her. Qin Chen smiled. Half a month. A month is for you. Chapter 44:30. However, it would be New Year's Day in 20 days. It was inhumane to stay in the hospital. Qin Mo looked at his sister. Half a month. My mobile phone remembers to bring wonderful novels to you. He Huan immediately understood that Qin Mo knew about Lawyer Bai's visit. She chuckled. If she goes home, won't they be closer? Qin Mo's voice was slightly hoarse. She will only go to my place to recuperate. Are you sure and certain? Qin Chen looked at his honorable second brother with a smile. You're so confident. It just so happens that no one is taking care of He Huan now. Why don't you take care of her? Qin Mo was rendered speechless by her words and could only stare at his sister. Qin Chen smiled. Okay, let's eat. You seem to have lost a lot of weight recently. How are you going to pursue He Huan if you don't eat? Qin Mo glanced at her again. At least you have some conscience. As he spoke, he really did eat something. Qin Chen looked at him and said very slowly, second brother. Qin Chen rarely called him that. Qin Mo looked up. Qin Chen said very slowly, actually, even if Dad and Mom scolded you for being like this, I would still think that you're a mad dog. But we're family after all. Have you ever thought that if He Huan were to make up her mind, the two of you would really be finished? She used to love you, so it might be better if you pester her more. Qin Mo immediately lost his appetite. He glared at his sister. What are you thinking about every day? It's for your own good. Qin Chen rarely showed her girly side. She walked over and hugged her second brother from behind. She rested her face on his shoulder and softly said, second brother, you must be happy. You must be well. Qin Mo's heart softened. Qin Chen rarely acted like this. As soon as he opened his mouth, his voice was slightly hoarse. What's wrong? Qin Chen closed his eyes. I'm worried about you. Qin Mo felt very upset. After a long time, he said in a hoarse voice, I'll be fine. I'm afraid that you'll be alone for the rest of your life. Qin Chen's voice was low and deep, and he sighed with emotion. It was also a little hateful. Qin Mo turned his head. He was a little angry at first, but when he saw the expression on Qin Chen's face, Qin Chen was really worried about him. He let out a long breath and said in a low voice, I won't. Qin Chen looked at him. Really? Qin Mo smiled and patted her face. Of course not. When Qin Chen wanted to move away, the chief of surgery happened to have a surgery to discuss with Qin Chen, so he came to discuss it. Unfortunately, there were a few assistant nurses behind him. As soon as the door was pushed open, they saw Qin Mo patting Qin Chen's face. Everyone knew that they were brother and sister, but Qin Chen's appearance was really very neutral, so the scene became indescribably classic. The deputy chief opened his mouth like a crocodile, and the young nurses behind him covered their faces and wanted to scream. The scene was really too fucking cute. Qin Chen heard the movement behind him and turned his head. Seeing their expressions, he knew what they were thinking. She couldn't help but roll her eyes. It was also a kind of trouble for people to be too good-looking. Seeing that she had something to do, Qin Mo didn't stay any longer. I'll leave first. Don't you want to eat? Qin Chen called him and sat down holding his hand. Qin Mo's eyes darkened. I'll go see He Huan. Qin Chen smiled and didn't say anything else. On the other side, Qin Mo went out and broke the hearts of the young nurses. Chapter 44:31. When Chinamo walked out, he broke the hearts of all the young nurses. They also wanted to see the two handsome men together. Although Chen was a woman, it didn't affect them from the perspective of appreciation. The young nurses were ready for the next scream. Chen looked at the group of young nurses and could not help but roll his eyes again. Being too good-looking was really a kind of trouble. While she was discussing the surgery with the deputy chief physician, Chinamo went to the ward. He Huan was still in the ward and there were two specialized nurses taking care of her. He didn't go in immediately. Instead, he stood outside and watched her quietly. My mobile phone remembers to bring wonderful novels to you. He Huan was also eating. She declined the nurse's offer to feed her and chose to eat with her left hand. Of course, it was very inconvenient for her to eat with her left hand, but she still insisted on eating with her left hand. Even though she ate very slowly, she still looked a little awkward. Sometimes she would be lost in thought for a while. No one knew what she was thinking about. Chinamo wondered if she would think of him when she was in a daze. But he smiled bitterly. Even if she wanted to, she would probably be gnashing her teeth in hatred. Chinamo quietly watched for a while, then pushed the door open and went in. The nurses all knew him. Xingyuan was under Yi Muyun's name, and Dr. Qin was Qin Mo's sister. Who didn't know Qin Mo's name? When he came in, the nurse hesitated for a moment before leaving. He Huan looked up and saw that Chinamo had closed the door. She stared at him blankly and put down the spoon in her hand. Her tone was extremely indifferent. "Why are you here?" Chinamo walked towards her and said in a hoarse voice, "I heard that your hand was injured, so I came to have a look." "Thank you for your concern, President Qin. I think if President Qin had shown mercy, I wouldn't have had a car accident. Isn't it unnecessary for President Qin to come over now?" He Huan said coldly. Chinamo had already walked to her side. He sat on the edge of the bed and reached for her set meal. To be honest, Chen took good care of her. Whatever Chen ate, He Huan ate too. Looked very delicious. He Huan was a little wary when he took it from her. "What do you want?" Compared to her sharpness, Chinamo seemed much gentler. He said hoarsely, "I'll feed you." He paused for a moment and said, "Don't force yourself if your hands are inconvenient. It's not embarrassing to let the nurse feed you." He Huan glared at him. "It's none of your business. I'll eat by myself." He maintained his original posture and looked at her quietly. Lu Xing culture probably won't be able to hold on for much longer. If you want to see it go bankrupt on the day you leave the hospital, I won't object. He Huan was still glaring at him. There was hurt and anger in her eyes. She had never known that a person could be so heartless to another person, to be so ruthless to such an extent. She didn't want to compromise, but the annoying truth told her that he would really do it. He Huan didn't eat immediately. She looked at him quietly. "Chinamo, what on earth are you going to do?" He began to feed her and said calmly, "You know what I said I wanted." "Impossible." She looked down. Chinamo were over. She couldn't accept the women who appeared from time to time. This time it was Su Ilio. Next time he was unhappy, who would be by his side? Ai Jia or another woman? Her voice was so low that it sounded like she was whispering, "Chinamo, I don't want to go on like this anymore. Let me go and let yourself go, okay?" Chinamo smiled gently. "But who will let me go?" Chapter 44-32. After Chinamo said that, there was a moment of silence in the air. After a long time, He Huan finally said in a low voice, "No one won't let you go. It's you who won't let yourself go." "Is that really the case?" Qin Mo's voice was a little cold. "He Huan, is that what you think?" She said yes. There was a very subtle indifference in the air. Qin Mo's expression was not good, but he seemed to be suppressing something. However, he finally restrained himself and continued to feed her. He Huan was unwilling, and his attitude was a little overbearing. Now that things had come to this, if He Huan still compromised, she wouldn't be He Huan. He was pressuring her and he was almost unscrupulous. In the end, she couldn't take it anymore. After a few pestering, she couldn't take it anymore and smashed the bowl in his hand. There was a crisp sound as if something had broken. Sounded like a bowl, but it didn't. It was the relationship between them that had broken. Chinamo looked at the broken pieces on the ground and the precious ingredients on the ground. It was as if she had smashed his heart into pieces. He Huan knew what he was thinking. There was a sneer in her eyes and she said in a low voice, "Perhaps you think that this is a gift to me, but Chinamo, I have never needed this kind of care. Save your care and warmth for other women. I will stand with my father. Even if the He family goes bankrupt, I will never compromise. Chinamo was still looking at her. He Huan's expression became even more terrible. I can't accept this kind of love and affection from you. Chinamo stared at the ground for a long time. Then he slowly stood up and said very softly, "What if I insist on making you accept it?" He Huan didn't want to talk to him. She closed her eyes and said, "That will depend on President Qin's ability. Oh yes, if you insist on doing something, I will choose to get married to fight for custody of Yi Huan." After she said that, Qin Mo's expression was quite terrible. He stared at her little face, not letting go of the subtle expressions on her face. He asked her word by word, "Do you really think that way?" He Huan replied coldly, "Yes." Chinamo smiled. His smile was very gentle. He even moved closer and said in a low and hoarse voice, "Then whichever man you have an affair with, I will destroy him. I want to see how cold-hearted you are." He Huan looked up at him. Yes, this was the Chinamo she was familiar with. He used his power and money to control her. Whether she loved him or not, she had no choice. And she was also tired. She agreed and slowly lay down as if she did not intend to continue talking to him. Chinamo was still looking at her and his voice became hoarser. "I'll make you beg me." He finally left. After He Huan left, the young nurses finally dared to come over and clean up the debris in the ward. When they asked He Huan if she wanted to eat something, He Huan turned her back and said in a choked voice, "No, you guys can take it." The young nurses looked at each other and did not dare to say too much. However, they still told the matter to Qin Chen. Dr. Qin drank her cup of coffee and sighed. "My second brother likes to force women. Isn't it good to coax women?" She thought about it and asked the nurse, "How is He Huan?" "Miss, he is in a bad mood and does not want to talk," the nurse said softly. Qin Chen nodded. "If I met such a pighead, I would not want to talk either. It's just a meal. Is there a need to threaten other people's lives? Besides, it's not like he doesn't know He Huan's personality." Chapter 44-33. He Huan stayed in the hospital and the news from the outside was getting worse and worse. It was very likely that Lushing culture was going to close down. Just thinking about it gave her a chill. She didn't understand why he needed to raise their relationship to the family. Kaim and Su Qing came to see her. She comforted her father and Kaim was very open-minded. "He Huan, as long as you make up your mind, Dad and Mom will always be on your side." He sighed again. "Glory, splendor, wealth, and rank are just fleeting clouds. Your mother and I have long been indifferent to it. As long as you are happy and safe. As for the things you don't want to do, don't do them. If you really can't do it, your mother and I will move to a small town. It won't be a problem for me to find a job to support our family." He Huan listened in a daze. Her heart was filled with mixed feelings. She looked up and there was a trace of tears in her eyes. When she opened her mouth, her voice was also hoarse. "Dad, I'm sorry for implicating you." At this age she still had to suffer. He Huan wanted to be confident, but she knew that she couldn't protect herself. Of course she could go abroad, but a Chinese director was suppressed in China. It was not hard to imagine what would happen in the future. He Huan didn't dare to be optimistic and she couldn't be optimistic. She could only recover from her illness and fight against Qin Mo's custody. In fact, she knew that she couldn't win, but to a certain extent she hoped to use this lawsuit to get something back. In her heart she also knew that she had let Yi Huan down. It wasn't that she didn't want her, but that she couldn't get her. He Huan was silent. Su Qing sighed. "What implicating? We are a family. Don't your father and I have the backbone to exchange you for glory, splendor, wealth, and rank?" He Huan pursed her lips. Su Qing continued, "It's just 3 meals a day. It's not a big deal even if it's just a simple meal. Besides, she had eaten in prison. Now that the family was together, there was nothing to be afraid of." With his parents' support, He Huan didn't say anything else. As a mother herself, Su Qing knew what He Huan was thinking. She thought for a moment and said in a low voice, "Yi Huan, do your best. We'll support you. I know she's a sore spot for you. Now that you've fallen out with Chinamo, if you can't get custody of Yi Huan, you won't be happy in the future." "Mom, I know." He Huan's eyes were watery. "I'll try my best." Su Qing came over and reached out to stroke her straight black hair. Her voice was very gentle. I hope that you can be happy. In the future, you will have the chance to find someone you like. Actually, how could she not know that it was very difficult? After the incident with Chinemo, He Huan wouldn't be easily moved. Lawyer Bai was a good person, but He Huan's attitude was still rather cold. As parents, they had endless worries. On the other side, an unexpected person came to visit He Huan. He carefully pushed open the door of the ward and poked his head out. He Huan was alone with 2 nurses accompanying her. The moment she turned around, she saw Ai Meng Meng. She was a little surprised. Why are you here? Ai Meng Meng pursed her lips and looked even more cautious. I heard that you were injured, so I came to visit. He Huan nodded. Thank you. Because Ai Meng Meng had done something to He Huan previously, she couldn't let it go. He Huan smiled faintly. What's that in your hand? Is it for me? Chapter 44-34. Ai Meng Meng immediately said, This is the soup I made. It wasn't very good at first, but Rong Yu helped to make it taste better. I don't know if it's to your liking. He Huan smiled. I'll know after I try it, but I know that Rong Yu is a good cook. Ai Meng Meng was not so nervous anymore. She walked over and carefully took the soup and poured a small bowl. Seeing that He Huan's hands were not convenient, she said that she would feed it to her. Surprisingly, He Huan did not refuse and drank a bowl. It tastes good. He Huan smiled. I'll drink the rest tonight. Ai Meng Meng was excited, but she tried her best to suppress it. He Huan was calm. I heard that you and Rong Yu got married. I've been busy and haven't had time to buy a gift. No, you don't need it. Ai Meng Meng's face turned red. Director He, your blessing is the best gift. He Huan smiled again. Why are you so nervous? Ai Meng Meng's expression was unnatural. After a while she said in a low voice, It's because my past was very bad. He Huan smiled. Since you said it's the past, then forget it. People have to look forward. It's not good to dwell on the past. Ai Meng Meng was stunned for a while before she said in a low voice, Director He is right. He Huan smiled. You and Rong, you can call me He Huan from now on. Ai Meng Meng's lips moved and she nodded. He Huan smiled and did not say anything else. Ai Meng Meng was stunned for a while before she left. He Huan sat alone in the ward with nothing to do. She looked at the bowl of soup again. After thinking carefully, he called his assistant and asked her to pick a gift for him. It was not very expensive, about 100,000 yuan, and he sent it to Rong Yu and Ai Meng Meng's home. It was past 3 in the afternoon when He Huan's assistant came to deliver the gift. Rong Yu accepted it calmly and thanked him. After a while, he sent the guests away and gave the exquisite box to Ai Meng Meng. He Huan gave it to you. Take it. Ai Meng Meng was a little uneasy and hesitated. It's for us. Wedding gifts are usually things that girls like. It can't be for me, right? Rong Yu smiled and threw the gift into her hands. Open it. Ai Meng Meng looked at him again and carefully opened it. There was a box inside. It was quite exquisite. When he opened it, he saw a crystal set of the 12 zodiac animals. They were very beautiful and cute. It's very pretty. Ai Meng Meng liked it very much. She looked up at Rong Yu. I like it very much. I put it in my bedroom. There was a cabinet in their bedroom. Rong Yu had a collection of ornaments and she could clean up a small space to put it in. After she finished speaking, she ran over. Rong Yu looked at her from behind with an indescribable look in his eyes. He followed her and saw that she had cleaned up a place and solemnly placed the 11 little crystal creatures there. It was a little out of place with some of the things he collected. It was even a little ridiculous. But he felt that it was very good. The truly good quality of a marriage and relationship is that there is no distinction between the parties. Where he was, there was a place for her. That was it. Ai Meng Meng put it away and turned her head. What do you think? Rong Yu looked at it and smiled. Very good. Chapter 44-35. Later on, he hugged her from behind. He didn't say a word and just rested his head on her shoulder. Ai Meng Meng bit her lip and said in a low voice, Rong Yu? Her voice was gentle, but there was also a hint of helplessness in it. She sounded like a young lady in love, but at the same time she sounded as shy as a newlywed wife in ancient times. Rong Yu said softly, I just want to hug you. We're husband and wife, so hugging is normal, isn't it? She felt that it was, but she also felt that it wasn't. In short, they were a little flustered and at a loss as to what to do. After all, they had only been confused once. They had only known each other for a few days and they knew nothing about each other. They did not understand each other at all. Ai Meng Meng thought about it a lot, but Rong Yu only repeated, "Meng Meng, I'm your husband." Later on, he kissed her. She thought about the word husband vaguely as she was kissed. Later on, he fulfilled his duty as a husband. Actually, Ai Meng Meng felt that it was a little unbelievable. Qin Chen appeared in He Huan's ward. She checked the condition of He Huan's hand. Then she thought for a moment and coughed. "How are you and Qin Mo?" He Huan was stunned. "Nothing." Qin Chen didn't say anything else and suggested, "Let's go take an X-ray." Although He Huan's hand was injured, Qin Chen still pushed her to take the X-ray, which made the nurses jealous. Dr. Qin Chen was the Prince Charming of the entire hospital. Usually, just a smile from him was enough to make them fall for him for an entire day, let alone pushing him like this. He Huan didn't feel that way. She had grown up in the Qin family and was used to the Qin siblings. After the X-ray was taken, there wasn't much of a problem. She just had to be careful not to drive or play the piano, and it was best not to do delicate or rough work. Qin Chen looked at his ex-sister-in-law and smiled faintly. "You can be discharged, but you can't run around after you're discharged. I don't want you to have a more serious injury than the last time I treated you." He Huan bit her lower lip and said nothing in the end. Qin Chen sighed. "He Huan, just bow down to my brother. You won't get the upper hand if you fight him head-on. He's completely crazy now." He Huan looked down. "If I give in, will he let me and my parents go? Or can you return Yi Huan to me?" Qin Chen sighed. "Is it really impossible for you?" Sitting in the wheelchair, He Huan stood up after a while. She smiled faintly and said, "Qin Chen, do you know? In the past, I used to think that self-esteem wasn't that important. I just wanted to live the life that I got. But now I can't back down anymore. I don't know how to live with him anymore. To him, I'm just someone he likes, not He Huan." Qin Chen played dumb. "It's the same in between, right?" He Huan looked at Qin Chen speechlessly. But she didn't explain. Anyway, Qin Chen would still pretend not to understand. In the end, Qin Chen helped her get discharged and sent her home personally. There was no one else who received such treatment. The expensive sports car slowly stopped in front of the apartment. It was a limited edition sports car and there was only one in the entire B city. It was at Qin Chen's place. Qin Chen helped He Huan open the car door. As soon as He Huan got out of the car, she saw a Mulsan parked in front of her. Chapter 44-36. He Huan looked at Qin Chen. Qin Chen shrugged. "It's just a coincidence." She wouldn't tell him that she had received 50 million yuan as a bribe, or He Huan would probably ignore her in the future. She coughed and said, "I still have something to do at the hospital, so I'll be leaving first, He Huan. Remember to use your right hand less, and it's best to hire a nanny at home." He Huan pursed her lips and didn't say anything. Qin Chen felt guilty. It wasn't easy to accept 50 million yuan. In fact, it wasn't that she was greedy, she just hoped that they could reconcile and that was it. Well, it definitely had nothing to do with greed. Qin Chen convinced herself. How could a handsome man like her feel guilty? She quickly got in the car and drove away. He Huan watched her leave and wanted to go back to her apartment. She really had a lot of things to do. Qin Mo got out of the car and stopped her. "Let's talk." She looked up at the man in front of her and after a long while she said in a hoarse voice, "What do you want to talk about?" "We can talk about Lushing culture, Yi Huan and us." Qin Mo lowered his head and said in a very gentle voice, which was a very humble attitude. If it were in the past, He Huan would have refused immediately, but He Huan thought of Qin Chen's words. She gently clenched her fingers and then smiled at Qin. "Okay, let's talk." She entered the elevator first and Qin Mo followed her. The two stood in the elevator in silence until the elevator door opened. His voice was a little hoarse. "Open the door." He Huan swiped the key and led him into her apartment. The apartment was the same as before, nothing had changed, but it seemed a little lonely because no one had lived there for many days. Qin Mo went to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. When he turned back, He Huan was leaning on the sofa in a daze. He put the water beside her hand and sat opposite her. When the sofa sank, He Huan glanced at him and said softly, "What do you want to talk about?" Come back to me, he said straightforwardly. Yi-Hwan was still leaning against the sofa. After a long time she chuckled softly. She was a little absent-minded but she slowly recovered. Can you let go of my dad's company? Can you let my movie be released as scheduled? Can you let Yi-Hwan come back? Of course, he said firmly. I can make it up to you. Compensation? Yi-Hwan chuckled softly. She seemed to be in a trance. She didn't say anything else. She just said that she was a little tired and wanted to rest for a while. However, while she was resting, Chinamo did not intend to let her go. He quickly and quietly approached her. Yi-Hwan's back was facing him. I'm very tired. Chinamo seemed to sigh. He just trapped her under his body and kissed her for a while. When he kissed her, Yi-Hwan did not resist, but she did not respond to him either. However, this was enough for Chinamo. She eventually fell asleep. Chinamo got up to deal with some business. He still hadn't solved the crisis of Lu Xing and Yi-Hwan's movie, let alone Yi-Hwan. He was a businessman. He had to see Yi-Hwan's sincerity if this was a business deal. When Yi-Hwan woke up, it was already nightfall. She called home without telling Chinamo that she was with him. Then she learned that the crisis was still there. When she hung up the phone, she was in a daze for a while. Of course, she knew what Chinamo meant. It was a business deal. She had to show him some sincerity. He had always made full use of his advantages and never showed mercy. Chapter 44-37. Just as she was in a daze, Chinamo pushed the door open and entered. He had already taken off his jacket and was wearing a pair of black casual pants and a beige sweater. He looked very comfortable and casual. Yi-Hwan was stunned again. She remembered that he didn't wear this before. However, she didn't ask. She just looked at him with a hint of wariness in her eyes. Chinamo wasn't blind. Of course he could tell. However, he quietly went over to open the curtains. It was already dusk outside. The street lights were on and it looked very prosperous from here. Chinamo stood there and turned to look at Yi-Hwan quietly. She had indeed lost weight again. Just like what Qinchen said, she was very fragile and could arouse a man's desire to protect her. Did that Bai Shulan also see her like this? And that's why she was infatuated with a married woman, disregarding her identity? Chinamo was a little angry, but he held it in and asked her calmly if she was hungry. He said that he had prepared dinner. Yi-Hwan still looked at him. What are you trying to say? He walked over and bent down to look at her quietly. Then he kissed her on the lips. Let's eat. We'll talk about it after we're done eating. Or you can think about it. Didn't you make a phone call just now? Yi-Hwan looked down. How did you know? I know everything about you. He bent down and kissed her again. His voice was a little hoarse. All right, get up and eat. You're too thin. He carried her out of the bed. The heater in the house was turned on, so it wasn't cold outside. Moreover, he had put a thick sweater on her. Yi-Hwan was carried to the dining room outside. He placed her on a chair and she looked at the table full of dishes. There were 6 to 7 of them and they were all nourishing dishes that she liked. She knew that he had put in a lot of effort into them. Chinamo scooped a bowl of chicken soup for her and placed it in front of her. Jade bamboo chicken soup, your favorite. Yi-Hwan looked up at him and said softly, actually, there's no need to cook so many dishes. Chinamo smiled. It's rare for us to eat together. I'll take you to the villa tomorrow morning. There will be 2 specialized aunties to cook. Will Aunt Lon come? She asked. Chinmo's ink-like eyes stared at her. After a while he smiled faintly. I won't. It's just the 2 of us. I transferred the auntie here from somewhere else. She won't disturb us. Yi-Hwan wasn't stupid. She knew that he was controlling and monitoring her in disguise. He had found his own people, but she didn't say anything. She just quietly drank her soup. Chinmo's culinary skills were excellent, but he didn't cook often. Yi-Hwan rejected him, but she didn't reject his cooking. She also knew that even if she ran around outside for 24 hours, it was not as good as 1 or 2 phone calls from Chinamo, so she was safe here, waiting for him to make a move. She also knew that there was a price to pay and that price was herself. Chinamo looked at her quietly. He watched her finish the bowl of soup, then scooped a bowl of rice for her and prepared some vegetables. Eat more. Yi-Hwan lowered her eyes and agreed. She pursed her lips and continued to eat the food in the bowl in silence. They were together. They had known each other since they were young. They had been husband and wife for so many years. They had so many intimate pasts, but now that they were together, they were like strangers, restricted, unfamiliar, uneasy and nervous. It filled their surroundings. Chapter 44:38. When the meal was finally over, Chinamo carried her back to the master bedroom and cleaned up. When he returned to the master bedroom, Juan was leaning against the headboard and watching TV. In fact, apart from her fractured hand, her body was even weaker. He looked at her for a while and said hoarsely, "I'll wash up and sleep later. I'll probably be up at 11 o'clock. Juan's eyes were on the TV, but she said to him, "I'll wait for you." Mo's body trembled, and the color of his eyes deepened, darker than the night. He naturally knew what she meant. As a married couple, he couldn't help but move his Adam's apple uncontrollably, and his voice was hoarse. "I'll be early." Juan's eyes were still on the TV, as if she was very focused, but if he looked closely he would find that she was nervous. Mo clenched his fingers, looked at her for a while and then left. He went to the study, but he didn't deal with work immediately. Instead, he just sat there and smoked quietly. After smoking for a long time, he didn't let out a long breath until the cigarette box was empty. When did it become a deal between them? Mo rubbed the cigarette box, sat there for a while and then got up and walked out. As for work, it could go to hell. When he returned to the master bedroom, it was already past 10:30. He thought that Juan was asleep, but she wasn't. She was still watching TV, and it was actually a children's program. "Why aren't you sleeping?" He looked at the faint shadow under her eyes and asked hoarsely. Juan turned off the TV and looked up at him. "Waiting for you." These 3 words crushed all of Mo's self-control, and he couldn't even say ordinary words. After a long time he finally found his voice. "I'll go take a shower first." Juan sat quietly and watched him walk into the bathroom with a bathrobe. She listened to the sound of him taking a shower and the sound of the water flowing. After about 10 minutes, Mo walked out, wearing a white bathrobe, and the ends of his black hair were dripping with water. He dried his hair and said casually, "You're ready to sleep." Afraid that she didn't understand, he added, "Sleep early if you're not feeling well." Juan stared at him for a long time before finally lying down. Mo dried his hair, but he didn't go to bed immediately. Instead, he went outside to smoke a cigarette and drink a glass of red wine. When he came back, Juan was already asleep. His brows furrowed slightly. In fact, he knew that Juan was exhausted and she was just waiting for him. Or waiting for him to make a decision. Mo reached out and gently stroked her face. His voice was extremely hoarse. "Do you hate me that much? Are you afraid of me? Are you always so reluctant to be with me now? Do I have to use conditions to even touch you?" As he spoke, there was a hint of bitterness on his face. Finally, he slowly lay down. Lying beside her, he lay quietly for a while. Then he felt that her breathing seemed to quicken a little. He knew that she was awake, so he tilted his head. "Are you afraid of me?" "No." Juan's voice was low. "I'm not afraid of you." Mo's voice was even more hoarse. "Put your head on my shoulder. I'll believe you." Juan bit her lip and finally put her head on his shoulder. Of course, it was a little stiff. Mo's voice was a little hoarse. "Sleep." He didn't do anything to her. He just lay straight. He thought that he was actually angry. He was angry that she didn't love him anymore. Chapter 44:39. Mo lay there quietly. He didn't say anything for a long time, nor did he fall asleep. As for Juan, her body was stiff as she slowly fell asleep. Mo looked at her quietly. After a long time he slowly closed his eyes. He couldn't fall asleep, but his breathing became calmer with her by his side. Eventually he fell asleep unknowingly. After that he had a dream. He dreamed of many things. They were all about him and Juan when they were young and what happened on their wedding night. Later, Mo woke up. When he woke up, it was a winter night. Juan was sleeping soundly beside him. He looked at her face quietly. Later he couldn't fall asleep, so he got up, put on a bathrobe and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window outside. Through the window he saw the gentle snow falling from the night sky. The snowflakes fell on the window and the shape of the snowflakes was especially beautiful. He looked at it quietly. After a long time he reached out a finger and touched it gently. Through the layer of glass, the snowflakes melted. He thought that perhaps he should wake He Huan up to look at the snowflakes in the past. But now he actually felt that it was nice to look at her alone. It was sad and beautiful. She was sleeping peacefully not far from his side. China Mo stood there for about half an hour. When he returned to the bedroom it was almost 4 o'clock. He lay down. Because his body was a little cold, He Huan moved away instinctively. He waited for his body to warm up before pulling her into his arms. With his chin on her shoulder, He Huan woke up. But she didn't make a sound. She just stayed in his arms obediently. After a long time he finally spoke. His voice was low and hoarse. He Huan, can you feel the pain? She didn't make a sound. She would lose if she did. She just leaned against him quietly and didn't say anything. After a long time she fell asleep again. When she woke up in the morning, China Mo was no longer in bed. The curtains were open. The light was a little dazzling. He Huan was startled. She almost jumped off the bed and ran to the window. Sure enough, it was snowing outside. It was white. She opened her eyes and looked outside. The snow was thick and it was still falling. There was a thick layer of fog on the glass. She reached out and wrote down Yi Huan's name. She thought of the little Yi Huan living alone. Just thinking about it made her throat feel blocked, and she felt indescribably uncomfortable. Her slender fingers wrote Qin Yi Huan's name over and over again. She realized that she missed Yi Huan so much. He missed her so much. China Mo stood at the door of the master bedroom and saw Yi Huan standing by the window in a daze. She was only wearing a thin nightgown. He took a nightgown and draped it over her. Then he carried her and placed her on his feet. "Aren't you cold standing like this?" he asked in a low voice. Yi Huan seemed to be stunned for a moment before she murmured, "Fortunately it's snowing. It's midnight." He sighed softly. "We'll carry you back." He carried her to the living room. He turned on the heater and covered her with a woolen blanket. She could sit on the sofa and watch the snow outside. There was a cup of fruit tea beside her hand. Yi Huan's fingertips were warm. It was as if love and marriage were within reach. If she wanted to, she would be able to touch them immediately. But she lowered her eyes. It wasn't that she didn't want to convince herself, but she couldn't. "What are you thinking about?" China Mo asked her in a low voice. Chapter 44-40. Yi Huan looked at the snow outside quietly. China Mo seemed to have gone for breakfast. After a while, the aroma of food wafted in the air. A warm house, snow outside the window, and a handsome man. All of this could be said to be a lifelong dream for ordinary women, but Yi Huan didn't think so. He was afraid. He was extremely afraid of China Mo. She didn't know what he was going to do next. She held the fruit tea in her hands and smelled the fragrance. It seemed that she could only calm down. He didn't hug her last night. She didn't know if it was because he wasn't satisfied with her. She had lost a lot of weight after the miscarriage. Her body was almost broken and her face was as pale as a ghost. Men probably didn't have any feelings for her, right? If that was the case, why did he want to keep her by his side? Yi Huan couldn't understand. She thought that perhaps it was a man's possessiveness. She had been his wife, so he didn't want anyone else to touch her, not even a little. Or maybe he raised her at home. She didn't need to work or socialize, and he would raise a few women outside in the future. Was that what China Mo thought? Yi Huan was stunned. China Mo came over and his warm breath enveloped her. He wrapped his arms around her shoulders and lowered his head to kiss her hair. In a low voice he asked, "What are you thinking about?" Yi Huan bit her lower lip and subconsciously asked him what was on his mind. China Mo's expression changed. He looked at her quietly and after a long time he turned her face and kissed her. After the kiss, he reached out to carry her and walked to the master bedroom. 10,000 words were omitted. When she woke up again it was already noon. Yi Huan opened her eyes. China Mo was already gone. She closed her eyes and thought about what had happened that morning. Of course she wasn't reminiscing about it but thinking about why just as she was thinking, China Mo walked in and bent down to kiss her. "Get up for lunch." She was too thin now and felt like a feather. But compared to before, each had their own taste. Of course he wouldn't say that to her now. It would be too distant and he was still angry. It was impossible for Yi Huan to pretend to be asleep. She sat up and stared blankly at China Mo. "I'll wait for you outside. Go wash your face." He kissed her cheek in a husky voice and walked straight out. He Huan quietly watched his back for a long time before going to wash her face. What she found strange was that even though she had used up all her energy, her spirit was much better than before. The food he cooked was still very delicious. She ate a little too much and even her pale face had a trace of color. After eating, Chinemo carried her to the sofa to watch TV or watch the snow. Seeing that he took out his laptop and seemed to be dealing with work, He Huan couldn't help but ask, "Don't you need to go to the company? I'll stay with you for the next few days at least until the snow stops." He had already turned on the screen and said in a low voice, "Also, I wanted to use the helicopter to return to the villa, but the snow is too heavy. Let's stay here for a few days." More importantly, there was no one else here, just the two of them. Chinemo quietly thought that they might be able to cultivate some feelings for each other. He Huan replied with an "oh," and then didn't say anything else. She didn't want to watch TV, so she turned it off. In the quiet space, there was only the sound of Chinemo typing on the keyboard. Chapter 44-41. After an unknown period of time, Chinemo said, "I've made the call. Lucian culture has been restored. In addition, your movie will be screened on 214, and the number of seats will be around 40. After the new year you can also promote it when you're well. However, I've arranged most of the things for you. You don't have to work too hard." He could even spend $1 billion in the box office for her and buy a few big prizes. If she wanted to make a name for herself or anything else, he could help her do it no matter how she filmed it. After Chinemo finished speaking, He Huan was stunned for a moment before she thanked him softly. Chinemo, on the other hand, smiled faintly and said, "No need for thanks." There was an indescribable feeling in his heart. He had achieved his goal and she was also gentle to him. Even this morning she did not resist or reject him at all. However, there was something missing. Without love there would be less hatred. In the past He Huan did not really care about him, but when they came back once a year she was not like this. Now her heart was more like still water. Chinemo even had a trace of fear. He was afraid that they would never be able to return. After that they did not say anything. It seemed that it would be useless to say anything. He Huan did not call back to confirm because she knew that Chinemo would do what she had done. After watching the snowy scenery for a while, she said that she was tired and wanted to sleep. Chinemo carried her up and gently placed her on the soft bed. She was indeed exhausted, not just from this morning but from the past few months. When she fell asleep, Chinemo quietly watched her for a long time before he left to deal with his work. At about 4 o'clock He Huan's phone rang. Chinemo took a look. It was a WeChat message from a lawyer with the surname Bai. It said that he was outside and was here to deliver a document. At the same time he wanted to visit the patient who had just been discharged. Chinemo used He Huan's fingerprint to unlock the phone and replied, "I'll open the door for you." After sending the message he set another alarm clock just a minute later and went outside. Outside, Bai Shulan brought a bunch of hyacinths to ensure that He Huan would not be allergic. However, when the door opened, it was Chinemo's face. Bai Shulan was surprised and shocked, so she was speechless for a long time. Compared to Lawyer Bai's shock, Chinemo was gentlemanly. "Lawyer Bai, please come in." He turned to let the guest in and said lightly, "He Huan just woke up from her afternoon nap. I'll call her out." At the same time He Huan's alarm successfully woke her up. She sat up and heard someone talking outside. When she took a closer look she realized it was Lawyer Bai. He Huan grabbed her hair and looked at her phone. Then she realized that it was Lawyer Bai's voice. Not only did Chinemo use her phone to peek at her messages, he even replied. More importantly, she was sleeping and Bai Shulan came over. But no matter how angry she was, she had to go and meet the guest. Bai Shulan's work. He Huan put on her home clothes and went out. It was actually a little rude, but staying in the bedroom for too long was even more rude. When she went out, Bai Shulan looked at her. Chinemo turned back and said with a smile, "Go back and put on your slippers." He Huan looked down and realized that she didn't have shoes on her feet. She had forgotten. Biting her lower lip, she immediately ran back. When she came out again, the two men were sitting on the sofa and chatting. The atmosphere was harmonious. But He Huan knew that it was all an illusion. Chapter 44-42. He Huan walked over. Lawyer Bai. The location was different, the person was different, and the name was different too. In the past she would occasionally call him Bai Shulan. Lawyer Bai looked at He Huan and smiled. I'm here to deliver the indictment, but now, do you still need it? He Huan sat down next to Chinamo. She picked up the indictment and read it for a while. There was a hint of confusion in her eyes. It was an expression that He Huan had not seen since she was young. When she was confused, Bai Shulan kept staring at her eyes, not letting go of any expression on her face. At this moment, Chinamo stood up gracefully. I'm going to the study to take care of some business. You guys talk. The atmosphere was very strange. After all, the main character of the indictment was Chinamo. Now that the couple was living together again, he seemed a little unnecessary. At this moment, Chinamo left and the atmosphere was much more relaxed. He Huan poured him another cup of tea. Bai Shulan really liked her. After some thought she asked, Did you do it willingly? He Huan smiled faintly. I didn't have a choice. Perhaps Bai Shulan was a good choice, but she couldn't afford He Huan. She was like this now and her family was like this. She was no longer the proud and willful little princess. Without Chinamo she was nothing. Even if she could fly, Chinamo would end her freedom and break her wings. Perhaps she would never be able to fly again in this lifetime, but she was unwilling. However, she wouldn't tell Bai Shulan about this. She was just talking to him politely about business. It was not convenient to talk about personal matters. After the discussion it was already dusk. Bai Shulan saw that it was getting late and it was time to leave. At this moment, Chinamo came out and sent him off with He Huan. The two of them stood together to send the guest off. It was a very strange scene. Lawyer Bai turned around and smiled. Goodbye then. Chinamo casually placed his arm on He Huan's shoulder and smiled. Goodbye, Lawyer Bai. And no matter what, thank you. This word was really mysterious. Bai Shulan didn't dare to accept it. After Lawyer Bai left, Chinamo closed the door and looked at He Huan. He Huan gently broke free from him and walked to the sofa. It had only been a short while, but she was already exhausted. Chinamo followed and kissed her cheek. What are you thinking about? Oh. He Huan lowered her eyes and her gaze fell on the indictment. She stared at it for a long time before she picked it up, walked into the study and shredded it in the shredder. Chinamo was standing at the door. She knew he was there and looking at her, so she lowered her voice. Are you relieved now? Chinamo remained where he was and smiled faintly. He Huan, why do I feel that the indictment is still in your heart? Whatever you think, she said quickly. After he finished speaking, he was in a daze. Chinamo walked in and stood in front of her. He reached out and pinched her chin, forcing her to look up. He Huan was unwilling at first, but he was so domineering that she was forced to look up. Let's remarry him? He whispered in her ear and stared at her. He Huan's body froze. You're not willing? His voice was cold. He Huan looked down. No. Then let's go get our marriage certificate early tomorrow morning. He was calm and unyielding. Chapter 44-43. He Huan's heart raced as she tilted her head to look at him. He hugged her from behind and his voice became much gentler. It's going to be New Year in a few days. Don't you want to see Yi Huan? Yi Huan's voice trembled. Is that a condition? Chinamo didn't say anything, but his meaning was very obvious. It was a condition. Yi Huan lowered her head and after a long time she said yes in a low and hoarse voice. She only said one word, but this one word used up all of her strength and all of her emotions. When she turned her head again, there was a touch of moisture in her eyes. She looked at Chinamo, the man she used to love very much. Chinmo's eyes were like ink and he also stared at her. Just for a moment he seemed to be unable to bear it and kissed her. That night Yi Huan didn't sleep. She lay on the bed and Chinamo was next to her. He put one hand on her shoulder and consciously put her in the crook of his arm. If they were an ordinary couple, Yi Huan would think that this would be a very loving sleeping position, but unfortunately they were not. She turned her face sideways to look at his. Even in the dim light, it looked particularly handsome and threatening. He was almost 40 years old, but the Qin family had always been unique. Maybe it was because of Yi Liangqiu's good genes, but Qin Chen should be the best-looking one. If Qin Chen entered the entertainment industry, he would be the superstar of the century, an existence that could not be erased in the film industry. However, Qin Chen was only interested in the scalpel. Chinamo was the most masculine one among all the children. Yimuyun was more like a rich young master. He was a little gentle, but he was very violent and introverted. He Huan looked at them quietly for a long time, then stretched out a finger and gently touched Qin Mo's face. He didn't wake up. Maybe he was also tired. They were all tired. He Huan quietly left Qin Mo's arms, got off the bed, put on a coat and walked to the bedroom window. The snow outside was very deep, but the sky was still drifting with heavy snowflakes, blowing towards her through the glass, melting on the layer of warm glass. He Huan put his palm on the glass. It was cold, but the snowflakes were afraid. They were very much like her and Qin Mo. She stood there, her thin figure forming a faint reflection in the dim light. It was beautiful. Qin Mo woke up. He leaned against the headboard and looked at her quietly. He looked at her beautiful and fragile face. It was possible that she didn't belong to him. He quietly watched and watched, until a long time later he got off the bed and carried her from behind. His voice was husky as he said, "All right, let's sleep." He Huan froze for a moment. When she realized it was him, she softened her body and let him carry her back to sleep. But that night she tossed and turned restlessly, unable to fall asleep. She couldn't sleep and Qin Mo couldn't sleep well either. It was like they were consuming each other, consuming the night together. There was no winner or loser. The pain was the same. Qin Mo had enough of the pain of not getting what he wanted, but he didn't want to let go. Even if it was painful, he didn't want to let go. Because he didn't sleep well at night, he woke up later in the day. When He Huan opened her eyes were very sore and her head hurt. The sky outside was bright, so it shouldn't be early. She lay quietly for a while. She turned her head and looked at Qin Mo, who was putting on his tie with his back to her. His back was slender and strong, just like his character. At this moment he was very elegant and slow. He looked very serious, as if he had a lifetime to do this. Chapter 44-44. She didn't know if he was hesitant or conflicted about remarrying her. In fact, she couldn't figure out what he was feeling recently. Was it because he couldn't let her go, or because he didn't want her to be with someone else? He Huan's voice was hoarse. "Qin." He slowed down and then suddenly sped up. He tied his tie and turned to face her. He grunted and looked at her. He Huan bit her lower lip gently and sat up. Her eyes were on his face. She asked softly, "Have you thought about it?" Qin Mo's eyes were dark. He didn't answer her question directly. Instead he walked over and kissed her. His voice was a little hoarse. "Get up. We'll get our marriage certificate in a while." After saying that he walked out. He Huan sat there in a daze for a long time. It was only after a long time that she felt an indescribable pain in her eyes. She finally took out her phone and dialed her mother's number. Today was the Lunar New Year. She thought she should talk to her mother. She didn't know why, but she missed her mother very, very much. It was as if she had to listen to her mother's voice to have the courage to do what was going to happen next. Yes, it was dangerous and a little crazy. But she had to do it. She had to protect everyone she wanted to protect. When the call went through, Su Cheng's voice sounded. "Huan Huan, where are you?" The He family was in a mess because of the company. Su Cheng didn't know that He Huan was in the hospital. She was also busy from morning to night. He Huan's voice was a little soft. "Mom, I'm at home. How's the company?" "It's pretty good." Su Cheng breathed a sigh of relief. Everything is over. Although it was a big loss, the company was saved. Su Cheng paused as if she had thought of something. "I just saw the news. Your movie is going to be released in 214? He Huan nodded. "Yes. I'll give the tickets to your father at the premiere." "Mom, don't you like Kong Chiao the most?" "Kong Chiao should be there." Su Cheng was silent for a while before she whispered, "Actually, my favorite celebrity is Qin Mo's mother." Now that the two families were at odds with each other, there was no going back. They used to be so close. Su Cheng thought that He Huan shouldn't have married Qin Mo. That way things wouldn't have turned out this way. She asked He Huan to go home for dinner. Although it was snowing, at least the road was cleared. He Huan nodded. "I'll go back tonight." After hanging up the phone, she let out a long sigh as if she had completed some kind of mission. Finally it was over. When she hung up the phone, Qin Mo happened to come in and looked at her silently. He Huan dialed the number on her phone and smiled slightly. "My mom asked me to go back for dinner. Are you free, Qin Mo?" The color of his eyes changed. After a long time he smiled. Of course I'm free. He seemed to think for a moment. After we get the certificate we'll eat out. Come with me to the company in the afternoon and we'll go back together at night, okay? After some thought he added, you can sleep in my lounge. She compromised and he finally seemed to have found his thoughtfulness. Juan's feelings were quite complicated. She smiled slightly and didn't say anything else. Juan got up and tidied herself up. She picked a relatively formal dress and ate breakfast with Chinemo in silence. They traveled by helicopter because he said that he had an important meeting at 10 o'clock. Chapter 44-45. At 9 o'clock. The helicopter landed on a lawn somewhere. Chinemo got off first and then hugged Juan. Juan was wearing a white down jacket with a large circle of fur around her collar, which made her face look even smaller and made it hard to tell her age. Chinemo carried her all the way to the hall before putting her down. He reached out to take off her hat and thought for a moment. Take off your jacket later. It's still a little cold here. In fact, Juan was wearing a thick coat while he was only wearing a woolen suit. However, he didn't seem to be cold and his hands were very warm. At this moment he held her hand with his own and walked inside. The Civil Affairs Bureau was very quiet today. At first Juan thought that it was because it was cold and snowy so no one came out. However, she later found out that it was because the whole place had been cleared. Only she and Chinemo were there in the morning. The process was the same as before and Juan's mood was no different from the first time. It seemed that when they got married, it was not the time that she was willing so she always missed it. During the photo shoot the photographer was in a bit of a dilemma. After taking a few photos he was not satisfied. In the end he couldn't help but remind her, Mrs. Chin, you can lean over to Mr. Chin. Juan leaned over to Chinemo. Fine, continued taking photos but after a while he was not satisfied. Mrs. Chin, you can smile. Yes, smile a little but don't be stiff. Be natural. Juan tried hard to smile but the corners of her mouth were not natural. In the end Chinemo hugged her and whispered in her ear, just think about Juan. Juan's heart palpitated for a moment, and then she finally smiled more naturally and successfully took the photos. After half an hour Juan finally let out a sigh of relief. There was a hot marriage certificate in her hand, but it was taken away by Chinemo. She looked at him. His voice was very calm. I'll take care of it. Juan bit her lip. Chinemo smiled faintly. I'm afraid that you'll lose it. Juan still looked at him. He smiled again, reached for her coat, put it on for her, zipped it up and put on her hat. Let's go. He gave her a deep look. This time he was holding her hand as they left. Juan bit her lip and struggled a little. In return he pinched her with dissatisfaction. She felt a little pain and did not dare to struggle again. Outside Juan saw a dense crowd of reporters in the snow-covered land. As soon as she and Chinemo came out, the reporter seemed to have smelled the scent of blood and started snapping photos crazily. Juan was stunned for a moment. Then he turned his body and asked Chinemo softly, did you call them here? Chinemo didn't answer. He just put his hand on her shoulder and said with a smile, pay attention to your expression. Juan really wanted to retort at him but she could only play along. She didn't want a new storm to sweep through the He family. She and her parents couldn't bear it anymore. Chinemo was like the sun at high noon. No one knew how much power he had and how far he could stretch. Now she could only play along with him. Juan smiled faintly as if she was very happy, but she said to him, your meeting at 10 is a press conference, right? Are you going to announce the news of our remarriage? Chinemo smiled faintly and looked very happy. You're getting smarter. Juan looked down and didn't say a word. She just clenched her fingers quietly. Chapter 44-46. Chinemo only paused for a minute before he boarded the helicopter with Juan. Secretary, he was in charge of the aftermath. She had rushed over as well. Yeah, she had rushed over to deal with President Chin's love life. President Chin's passionate feelings for Director He were a little overwhelming. Passionate and high profile. She was a woman going through menopause. He was jealous. Secretary, he comforted the reporters. They could go to King Entertainment's press conference at 10 p.m. President Chin would explain in detail about his love life and marriage with Director He. Speaking of which, Secretary, he actually sympathized with He Huan. President Qin had cut off He Huan's escape route. In the past they had a semi-secret marriage and President Qin rarely showed his affection in front of the public. However, his remarriage this time was clearly very forceful. In the future, Director He and someone else. Oh, there would be no future. Secretary, he thought sympathetically as she got into the car. It was already 9:15 p.m. He had to rush back. She needed to take care of President Qin's love life. Asterisk at 9:40 p.m., Qin Mo's private helicopter slowly came to a stop in front of King Entertainment. On the first day of the Lunar New Year, the reporters were extremely busy rushing from east to west. However, to be able to chase such a big star meant that they would be settled at the end of the year. Who wouldn't be excited? Qin Mo carried He Huan down. He Huan couldn't resist, but she didn't want her face to be photographed either. Hence, she buried her face in Qin Mo's neck. But she didn't know that the more she did this, the more intimate and entertaining she looked. The reporters saw this scene. Ai Jia had no chance. Su Yilu had no chance. The original wife won. And she won effortlessly. President Qin's attitude said it all. Although he was domineering and overbearing, he was also a bootlicker. Qin Mo carried He Huan all the way to the elevator. She said that she wanted to come down. He lowered his head. We're already here. Let's go to my office. Even so, he still pulled her hat off and kissed it as if he couldn't help it. He Huan felt that he was possessed. They had clearly been together so many times, but he was still so passionate. She wanted to turn her face away, but after thinking about the consequences, she gave up and let him kiss her. Good girl. Qin Mo kissed her lips in satisfaction and smiled. He looked really good when he smiled, especially when he was relaxed and happy. He Huan froze for 2 seconds before murmuring, "What do you think I am now? Your personal pet? Wife." He was still smiling. "What do you think I am?" He Huan had her own stubbornness. She could not bring herself to say the word husband at this moment, so she remained silent. Qin Mo did not let her off. He smiled faintly. Can't say it out loud? Seeing that He Huan was still silent, he chuckled. If you can't say it out loud, I don't mind staying in the lounge with you for a while. The reporters might have some room for imagination. He Huan couldn't take it anymore. Qin Mo, must you be so despicable and overbearing? Qin Mo just looked at her with a deep gaze. He Huan thought that he would get angry, but he didn't. He just looked at her and chuckled. I prefer you like this. With just one sentence, He Huan's anger dissipated. If she continued to be angry with him, it would make her seem petty. Therefore, she didn't say anything because she didn't want him to get what he wanted. Didn't he say that he liked her like this? Chapter 44-47. Qin Mo understood He Huan's thoughts. After a long time, he lowered his head and murmured, "You look cute now." He even kissed her. He Huan stared at him. His voice became huskier. Start over, huh? He Huan couldn't help but ask, can't you keep a low profile? Oh. His tone became dangerous and forceful again. He Huan looked down. Is that one of the conditions? Qin Mo didn't answer her question because the elevator had reached the top floor. He carried her into the lounge and took off her coat. He reached out and touched her black hair. Sleep for a while. I can't sleep. I want to sit outside. He Huan answered quickly and slid down. Qin Mo looked at her silently and smiled. That's fine too. He Huan walked out and lay on the sofa in the lounge area of the office, looking at the snow outside. It was a different world from the 68th floor. It seemed to be snowing outside. Don't look at it for too long, it will hurt your eyes. Qin Mo came over and whispered in her ear. I'll ask Secretary Tu to bring you some hot fruit tea. He Huan liked it recently. Maybe she was feeling bitter and needed some sweetness. After he finished speaking, He Huan just nodded her head lightly and replied, Qin Mo couldn't help but say, He Huan, can you? He wanted to say something, but his pride didn't allow him to say it, so he took it back. He Huan didn't care. In fact, she knew what he wanted to say. Since he didn't say it, she would pretend that she didn't know. Qin Mo was silent for a while. Then he smiled faintly and reached out to stroke her hair. After he went out, there was a temporary silence in the spacious office. He Huan was immersed in such silence. She just looked outside, quietly watching the snowflakes. Secretary Tu came in. The office was quiet. She put the things on the coffee table and coughed. Mrs. Chen, President Chen asked me to bring you fruit tea. It's your favorite flavor. The secretary's heart fluttered. Sure enough, she was Mrs. Chen again. He Huan was still lying on the ground. He said softly, "Call me He Huan." The second secretary blinked. She didn't want to be called Mrs. Chen, did she? In fact, everyone knew about the incident with flourishing culture. President Chen had spent so much effort just to force He Huan to turn back. He had put in a lot of effort. The second secretary let out a long sigh. In this world, it was not to say that the people involved who felt good would enjoy themselves. Perhaps this kind of love was a kind of restraint, a kind of imprisonment. She looked at He Huan and the smile on her face disappeared. The past was different. The second secretary heaved a long sigh. It was not easy to be a woman of a rich family. She didn't dare to say more, so she left and closed the door again. On the other hand, He Huan was still lying there quietly looking outside. It was like being locked in a tower with no freedom. She knew that after the promotion she would lose her freedom. From now on she would be Mrs. Chen and fewer people would call her He Huan. As for Director He, it was just a dream of hers. She lowered her eyelashes and a teardrop stuck to her long eyelashes. He tried hard not to let it fall. Her surname was He, but she grew up by Chen Mo's side. She couldn't even choose whether she loved him or not. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.